Here is a graphic of Europe in 1910 before World War I. The top 10% own almost all the wealth. The middle 40, the bottom 50, almost none. Next graphic. Scandinavia, the most equal country the world's probably ever seen. Still the top 10% own 50%. The middle 40, 40. The bottom 5. And then there's us, just about now. The top 10%, 70%. And if we go one more, John, and break the top 10% into the top 1% and the next 9%, here's the top 1% of the United States. You add this, and together you've got the top 10% in the middle and so forth. Pretty substantial inequality. All right. Next is a cause and effect mechanism. So go ahead. This is a second piece of information that Piketty spends chapters trying to prove to the readers is real. Historically, if you have slow economic growth, the capital income ratio will rise. And if you're thinking, if you've got it locked in now, if the capital income ratio rises, what happens to inequality? It rises. If you've got fast economic growth, capital income ratio tends to at least not rise much, maybe even decline a little bit, which would mean inequality declines. So, well, that's a piece of information, but why is that? I mean, we've got to try and explain why that would be, because you can't just say that and walk away from it. So go ahead. Why would that be in a slow-growing economy? Why would the capital income ratio rise? Well, what do you do with the profit from capital? So imagine this person that owns $1 million piece of rental property. Earns, let's say, $50,000 rent that year. What's that person do with that money? In a slow-growing economy, you tend not to reinvest it in a new business. There's not a lot of hope out there that the economy is growing very fast. Instead, you save it. Well, that saving is capital. So the denominator, capital, grows. Wages that would be produced by more job growth, income doesn't go up much. And the capital income ratio grows. In a faster growing economy, it's quite the opposite. A great deal of investment of money into wage producing jobs. Wage is the denominator, it's income. Capital doesn't accumulate as much. Capital income ratio declines. So you don't want a slow-growing economy. You'll get more inequality. Okay, well, that's all fine and dandy, but now we start really going into real interesting stuff. So what's going to come next when John pushes his button here is a graph of growth rates from antiquity to 2100. Now the antiquity stuff is a little bit farcical maybe, but deal with this. So what do we got for growth rates? Go ahead, John. Growth rates, G, that is the amount that an economy is growing per year historically. And we're just going to ignore antiquity up to 1700. But here's 1700 to 1750, to 1820, just before the Industrial Revolution. Not much growth, 0.5% growth. And what's the formula now? Slow growth means higher capital income ratio, more inequality. But we get this incredible period of time here. The Industrial Revolution happens. And growth jumps from 0.5% to 1.5%. It triples rather quickly because of the Industrial Revolution. Still fairly low growth, but less inequality. And then this miracle period in which everyone in this room has been born and will live your life. And a period which probably will never happen again in human history. Which is a stunning statement, isn't it? yeah. Okay. Get off the floor here. Where economic growth is beyond belief as far as human history has gone and probably will never return again. And we got skeptics out here. Like, come on. Well, hold on. Piketty's got answer to your skepticism. I mean, it's just unbelievable here in 1950 to 1990 what the economic growth is, and that's per year for 40 years, 4%, 4%, 4%, over and over again. That's fast economic growth. It's incredibly fast economic growth. And inequality of its own, without any taxation and so forth, sort of declines. Well, what's the future like? The title of the book is Capital in the 21st Century. Well, here's the 21st century. And growth rates drop. And of course, the thoughtful people out there say, well, you better convince me that. You can't just say that. You better, well, we're going to explain that in a minute. In any case, if that's true, there has to be a rethinking of inequality and what to do about it. All right. Next graph, before John puts it up there, next graph is going to be different. It's going to be capital income ratio on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And it's just three European countries from 1870, just before World War I, through World War I, and projected out into 2100. So go ahead, John. Capital income ratios. What's the formula? High capital income ratio, relatively high inequality. Low, lower inequality. So what do we got? Up to World War I, incredibly high capital income ratios, incredibly high inequality in Europe. And then World War I, the Depression, World War II hits. And by the time Europe and these three European countries, it's almost irrelevant, frankly. It was fun for us that had 7 weeks to read this book to look at every country step by step. We can't do this tonight. But by 1950, the income ratio, capital income ratio has dropped very low. Relatively low inequality. But then it starts to rise again. And it will, and here we are at 2010. If you project this out, capital income ratios in Europe are probably back to pre-World War I levels long before we hit the end of the 21st century. So what? And if one has got a level of skepticism or even fatalism about it, you say, well, that's the way the world is. We just have to suck it up and deal with it. Piketty wants to say, no, that's not true. There are things that can be done not to change the growth rates, not to change the capital income ratio. That's kind of locked in. But there are things that can be done to keep that inequality from getting catastrophically bad. And just to reconfirm, Americans in this highly individualist society seem to have an intuition that it would be better to do something about it, rather than to say, oh, well, that's the way capitalism is. So it is Piketty's goal. It is Piketty's goal in this book to provide mountains of data, mountains of explanation, and get people to think about this, because his vision of especially the second half of the 21st century, is kind of rough. And there are people in this room, the youngsters that showed up, we're thrilled that you did, that live in the second half of the 21st century. Some of us won't, but okay. So here's the Piketty primer. The next slide is the Piketty primer. If you get nothing else out of it, this is what he would like you to take home from a little session like this, or if you read all 550 pages. 3 things. 1, economies are for sure slowing. Global economies are for sure, and we got to explain that. We can't just say that. But global economic growth is it is already slowing. It will continue to slow. That's a devastating reality to have to deal with. Positively is B. He says there are remedies to that to keep that slowing economic growth from producing such incredible inequalities that you get the catastrophic violence that we had in World War I and World War II, and certainly we see more and more around us today. And 3, and perhaps most important of all for the purpose of the book, he says democratic society's got to talk about this. Not just vote, but really talk about it with knowledge and information, not vocabulary left over from the Cold War, communism, capitalism. He says that's long gone, and it should be put aside so people can have real discussions about this stuff. So point number 1. Why is world global economy slowing? Inevitably, he says. He says there are 2 factors, if we look at it in a big, big way, that are responsible for economic growth. One is just sheer demographic growth. The more people you have, the more people are working, you get economic growth. It may be destructive for the environment, but it sure is good for opening jobs. The more people, the faster the population grows, the better for wealth creation. The second factor is technology. The more good tools you've got and the better tools you've got, your hour of work can produce more wealth than before you didn't have the tools. And those two factors both have got some issues coming up. Look at the various different areas and break out those two factors of economic growth. So output is total growth in an area, in that era. The population is how much demographic growth contributed to that total growth, how much technological productivity contributed to that total growth. Well here, pre-revolution Europe, pre-revolution world, there's not a great deal of economic growth. 0.5% is not much. A lot more than the 1700 years before that, but still not much. And most of it came from population growth. Well yeah, there's no industrial revolution yet. Look at the industrial revolution period though, the early industrial revolution. Output triples. Where does the growth come from? It's more from technological machinery than it is from population. Although the population contributor of 40% is still significant. And then there's the post-World War I up to just a couple of years ago era that we lived in, the highest economic growth the world will probably ever see. And if you break it out into a smaller piece of time, 1950 to 2012, just sort of miraculous economic growth every year, year by year. Of course, it's not steady, but the averaged out, unbelievable. Well, what's the contributing factor? Close to half of it comes from population growth, the other half from technology. And then you jump down to the rest of the 21st century and say, whoa, one, economic growth does slow, but look at this. What population contributes to that growth really drops from nearly 50% to 21%. Whereas technology, at least is projected to continue on producing close to 1.6% of that growth. Why is that? Why is that? Most people, especially Mr. Salenbacher students and others, know the graph. They've seen this over and over again. The graph of world population from 1700 to just about now. And if we went back to 1000, it's a stunning thing. It's just almost flat, and then it sort of rises like crazy. So as World War I opens, there is 1.7 billion people on the planet. 100 years later, there's 7.1 billion people on the planet. Just reverse the numbers, easy to remember. Incredible demographic growth. Well, of course you're going to get stunning economic growth even if there's no technology, simply because of more people working. You say, well, you know, but all those people destroy the environment. That's true, but they do create jobs. They do create wealth. The next graphic is the more daunting, and it's not the same graphic as this, so don't get confused by it. But go ahead, John. This does not say that the world population is going to shrink and go back to 1 billion. This is still all population growth. This is a graph of the rate of growth, however, the rate of growth. So there's still population growth down here. It's just much slower. In fact, in the year 2100, I mean, we're about 7.5 billion people right now. The middle scenario prediction, you take everyone's prediction, especially the best people, and give them more weight. The middle scenario prediction of population is about somewhere between 9 and 10 billion by the end of this next century. But look at the rate of growth of the population. It drops like a rock. Well, if it drops like a rock, what happens to that portion of economic growth that is dependent on demographic growth? It almost goes away. Next graphic. I mean, here are some numbers for the second half of the 21st century, which many of you in the back of the room are going to be still living, happily living, we hope. The whole world is projected to only be growing at about 2% population in that last 50 years. But look at some of the continents. Europe will be shrinking. Asia will be shrinking even more. China peaks probably about 2026. What year is it now? 2014. That's almost tomorrow. China starts shrinking somewhere around 2026. The Americas, this is all the Americas, not just us. No population growth whatsoever. The only continent that is predicted to grow is Africa. And of course, Africa is far the poorest. And we'll see with the Ebola and so forth. But there is very little demographic growth.